Hello, world. Welcome to episode 2 of the Ancient as Mod pod. I'm Grace Aresi, and I'm here with George, and we're going to be talking about everything, just like we did last time. But in case you missed last time, a big recap of it is we were essentially just talking about our identities. How would you sum up our first episode in like 2 sentences or less, George?
Yeah, I guess identity and belonging. That theme was present throughout. I think we were talking about, um, indigeneity. If we are not indigenous, to a certain place, where are we indigenous to? And sort of the threads that can be pulled from for people of mixed race. And I think there's right now with AI, kind of weaving in the modern. AI is also making a lot of people question even their businesses. There was this video that came out from a guy named Daniel Priestley, and he was essentially saying like this AI period, you got to treat your business as if it's dead already, and essentially you have to renew your identity around what your business means with being AI first. And so there's a lot of, I think, identity things going on for people on multiple levels, whether it's an indigenous level, whether it's AI in your business, or even identity with careers. A lot of people have lost their jobs, and I think people are asking themselves, well, was I even happy in the job that I was at previously? Is that the career for me? Should I still be doing that? What would the future look like if I was doing what I feel like I should actually be doing? So I would sum it up that way and tie it into probably what we're going to talk about today.
I think that that's actually a really good segue into what you've been up to. So for those of you who don't know, George has a little group. I don't know if it's little. I think it's like big in real life and also big in digital life, but where we get stuff done. And right now there's a cohort that I'm a part of that I'm not always active in because I do have a day job that does take up all my brain power sometimes. But we're working on various AI, inspired AI infused projects that support our businesses. And something that you had us test, I hope it's okay that I'm like letting the internet know, was you're utilizing your ancestry to kind of figure out how you should be working. And you had me take that little quiz, and I came up as a wayfinder, and which I'm not surprised by. And I was very excited. But the way of the wayfinder is so different than maybe some other traditions, right? So could you tell us a little bit about that little like quiz you had me take? I know you took it as well, and what your philosophy is about working within your tradition, even at work.
Yeah, no, it's a very good segue. And I'll see if I can actually share my screen. Yeah, I probably can. So give me a sec. So let me do a screen and let's go here. All right. Do you see my screen?
I see the screen.
Excelente. Okay, cool. So this is the quiz that I had shared with you. And, we can include this link in the comments for the video so people can test it out themselves. And the idea here, right, was to play around with archetypes, play around with the idea of if we looked into your sort of genealogy, your cultural heritage, what might that reveal about your, I guess, style when it comes to tools and work preferences. And as you mentioned, right, you got Wayfinder and yeah, or Navigator, I think it was the same thing. So Navigator, Wayfinder. And this ties into a blog post that I then consequently wrote about how modern digital navigators should treat content creation, because I think that's the part that is different. So, when we often hear advice from the gurus in the marketing world or whatever is popular, I have this saying that, what's popular isn't always what's true, and especially for you. And so it's important to be able to filter, right, the noise that we get online. And I think what I've been coming to terms with more and more is that as AI is accelerating stuff, our inner tech, our inner systems need to actually be more refined than the external tech that we've become dependent on or have come to rely on. And so as a navigator, right, if we look at these sort of archetypes, each of these archetypes will have a certain style or mode when it comes to publishing content. And for the navigator, what did I have here? So the guidelines for navigators is anchor over volume. So one strong signal repeated beats 10 scattered shot takes. Maps, not megaphones. So your content should orient, not overwhelm. And let me just make that bigger. So your content should orient, not overwhelm. Context over virality. So a smaller aligned audience with shared coordinates is worth more than mass reach. And this goes to my GSD lab, which you're a part of, Grace, where it's a smaller group priced correctly can sometimes be better than having a mass audience who don't pay you anything. And so it really is about optimizing for yourself and what you want. People who are on social media, they want to become famous or want to magnify to the masses. And that's a certain archetype, right? That's fine. But if you're, say, a navigator archetype, you're going to want to have a strategy that is catered to that archetype, which is influenced by your genetic heritage. And you might see here, I have this tab open. I found this term recently, Grace, called cognitive heritage, and I never heard of it.
I've never heard of that either.
So I've heard of cultural heritage, but I noticed that sadly, like in the West, I think because of a lot of the conflicts around, DEI and multiculturalism and that sort of stuff, I've noticed that certain people in the West, and when they hear culture, they associate it with that and being woke and that sort of stuff. And, as we know, words and language are powerful. And so when I heard about this, I kind of liked it because it talks here about the collective knowledge, beliefs, values, and cognitive frameworks that are passed down. So the way I interpret this is your thinking mental patterns, right? Which are influenced by culture and genes, etc. And I guess it's a way of kind of talking about the same thing without necessarily triggering people, depending on who you're talking to, right? This is all
Right.
contextual. Yeah. But I found this and I thought you'd find it interesting.
I do think that that's really interesting. And I really kind of thought that this idea of like working within your ancestry, right?
Yeah.
And honoring where or whom you came from
Hmm.
is complicated. What do I
Yeah.
mean by that? What I mean by that is there are numerous people that, for whatever reason, don't have access to that information, right?
Yeah.
So, on one hand, you might have pieces of it, but not all of it. You might be able to only go back so far, but not as far back as you would like, especially for Black and Brown people in the Americas, right? And so, when we think of that and we think of what tradition do you work in, or how do you model your this idea of cognitive heritage is actually really interesting to me because it sounds like it's almost a social component of like epigenetics, this
Yeah.
idea that you have ingrained inside your DNA history and time locked into the physical cell memory, right?
Yep.
Which science is finally catching up to, but in so many traditions, people have sung songs about this, people have done dances about this, people have woven tapestries about this. They say things like within you is your mother's 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 mother, right? Like there's all these like different kinds of sayings that honor this idea that you carry wisdom within you that comes from behind, that will carry in front of you. And and I feel like this honoring in the way we work is provocative. And I think it's provocative. One, for the reason you said, right? Everything is woke now. If you say culture, it's like, oh no, DEI. We're not going to get into that today. But the real interesting thing for me is, well, what would it look like if we all worked within our cognitive heritage, right? Or our ancestral technology? So for me, I descend from storytellers, right? I want to always do everything in story. And I have found in my work, even when I was like a solutions engineer and a solutions consultant, I was, even when doing technical things, telling a technical narrative, a technical story, and now I'm on the marketing side of it. And it was always about constructing a world, constructing a vision that I could take my customers on a journey to. And now it's like now it's a thing, right? Now everyone wants to tell a story to sell their product. Now we know that you got to get them on the hook with a good story, whatever, phrasing is trending. But it is within my own heritage, and it's within the heritage of a lot of African descendant people across the world, right? And a lot of indigenous people, period, around the world. And so I just think, is this in opposition with the current capitalistic system as it stands? Like, that's the question I ask myself, because I think that even with the context of AI, I'm interacting with AI, like, you put me on the Claude and some other AI tools. Of course, ChatGPT is there. There's Perplexity. There's Gemini. I'm not gonna name any more people because they're not paying any sponsorship dollars yet. And it's like whenever you interact with these systems, right? These language models, they are themselves are trying to tell you a story. They themselves are trying to craft a vision of a world in order to take in information, refine information, provide information. And it just kind of makes me wonder, is AI actually, I don't want to say oppositional, but does it stand somewhere in a friction state with the current economic model that exists? You kind of were alluding to that in the beginning, right? Like people's jobs are changing, people are losing jobs, people are having to just imagine that their jobs are gone because AI has pushed them out. What's like the bridge here between this idea of utilizing ancestral knowledge in the way you work and new technologies and future tech like AI? Like, what's the convergence for the future for all people, but especially for maybe people who are looking to infuse their identity into their work?
Yeah, obviously we'll have to see what plays out over time, right? But I think my sense so far is that I think we know that there is wisdom that often comes out of many indigenous cultures, old cultures, about everything being connected. And I'm not too sure if I talked about this in our last session, but there's a blog post which I'll share. We can link in the comments later, that I wrote that had to do with, I think, research about just AI models right now and the reasoning classes that they're going after. And essentially, there's like a class 4 reasoning level that they're seeking LLMs to get to, and that's probably in line with AGI stuff. But when I was reading it, the complexity, the reasoning of a class 4 reasoning system literally echoes indigenous like worldview, which is everything is connected. And now wisdom has been there all this time. And so in terms of convergence, right, if everything is connected, then essentially a super intelligent being would know that to hurt any one part of that system hurts the whole, right? And I think right now, the reason why I think LLMs as they stand are at like a class 2, 3 in between there is because our own Western worldview is literally that sort of reasoning, which is that we are separate and we are not connected, right? So to me, that was super fascinating to sort of read and see the correlations. And then in terms of convergence, what I'm seeing now is that people are starting to identify these biases in the LLMs, right? And there was another study too that was showing like the further away a country or user was country-wise from the West, the less they trusted the responses from ChatGPT, Claude, etc. The less they felt like it actually was accurate. Interesting, right? And I think this ties into that sort of cognitive heritage. We do inherit a like worldviews in our mind. I think the other part about mind is that it is more than just the brain, right? In the West, we have an obsession with the brain and logic and that sort of stuff. But the mind, there's more and more science supporting what was known way back in the day, that the mind is more than just the brain. And so that mind is in cells, like you mentioned. And with that, it means that I think the collective consciousness that's kind of being sucked into AI right now is, it's like a part of our collective consciousness, but of course not the whole. And I think different regions are identifying this or realizing this because Western LLMs are going to have Western bias. And despite all of its efforts, it's not going to be able to capture all the nuances of culture. And it's why I kind of always been obsessed with culture, because it's something that a lot of us talk about, but it's still something very hard to kind of put our finger on and tangibly do anything with, right? And I sometimes see if like my own efforts to try and tangibly do something with culture is futile after a recent discussion with some members from GSD Lab in our last monthly demo session. But one of our members, she had actually kind of identified a blind spot in some of the ideas I was putting forward around culture stuff, because she was saying that like as soon as you try to say that this culture is represented by these things, you've already lost the culture, right? Because it's so things are shifting constantly, right? Like, and we see how people, when they are talking about culture, if they feel very strongly towards a culture, who's the culture bearer?
Right.
Who assigns, like, who gives the right for someone to be a culture bearer? So I think all these nuances show the limits of our tech, and then also it makes it difficult for that convergence to be identified because it's fluid. It's like water, right? This cosmic weaving, cosmic web. But yeah, I hope all of that kind of connects and answers what you
Yeah.
asked. That's sort of my thoughts on it at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up something interesting about culture that I think does tie into this like bigger weave here. And it's, I mean, I don't think I'm the only person to call it this, but I have this idea in my mind about the new artifacts. That's what I'm calling them. And I'm sure someone else somewhere is also calling them. So please, anyone in the comments who's like, I've already heard this. Okay, great. Thank you. Like, tag the person because independent invention is real, y'all. But this idea of the new artifacts, right? I think what I think about all the time, the prompt that I love to play with is, well, what if the lights went out right now? What would an otherworldly species, creation, who came to Earth say we were, or we did, or we made? Because for a long time, thousands of years, the artifacts were tangible. So, to your point, culture was actually a thing. What do I mean? It was a song that was sung, it was a hairstyle that was made, it was an outfit that was worn, it was a bowl that was drunk from, it was a pipe that was smoked, it was a cane that was used in ceremony. It was, it was this, it was that, it was a style of constructing your dwelling. It was a way in which you prayed over your hunt. Like culture was this. It actually was a bit rigid because the only way to access the culture was to live in the tribe or to live in the collective, the clan, whatever you were calling your grouping of people. And all of the artifacts supported the culture, even if the culture artifacts were intangible, like a song, right? Or whatever, or a hairstyle, which may not exist if the body goes to dust. Okay, so there's that. But in this new world order that we've been marching towards, we have all of these digital artifacts, right? We've been talking about AI. AI is letting you publish a document here, publish the code here, send the code to your Git repo, create an app out of it, make a video from it. If the lights go off, all of that is done. So if our electricity and energy sources ceased to exist and we had to legitimately make fire and cook over open fires and use knives to hunt, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like if we had to go back real rudimentary and we just didn't have access to technology like we did now, and everyone was using a straight up dial up phone or, better yet, carrier pigeons, we would have no artifacts of this time. And so when I think of the new artifacts, I think of the lights going off. And when I think of the lights going off, I think of, well, then what is culture now? Because then what's the new culture? It's even why when I was thinking of what to name New Native, I was like, it's New Native, but not NEW. One, I wanted to be a little bit kind of like avant garde. But two, it's because, well, what is the new thing? What is it actually? Because how do we quantify culture going forward in the age of technology? Does it mean we do what you're saying, right? Or what this publication you mentioned, these cultural specific LLMs that are being trained in very specific ways that may have a particular lens? Or does it actually mean that we should take a cultural position like people who are a little further from the West, who are a little bit kind of unsure of the accuracy of whatever AI tools they might be engaging in? It's like, is the new artifact us? And if we are the new artifact, right, what does that actually mean? And it reminds me a lot of when I lived in Portland, I learned about like the Cyborg Manifesto and this concept of cyborg anthropology, which was very new to me. But essentially, it's this idea that when we augment our human selves, we become cyborgs. So, like our smartwatches, like my smart ring, which don't worry, it's not the one that was recently being written about in the news. But this idea that all this tracking of ourselves, all this monitoring of ourselves actually does create this new model where we cyborgs, we are the thing. So maybe we are the new artifact. So I'm rambling a little bit, but it's just really got me thinking, like, if the lights go off, who will the future say we were?
Oh, man, that brings up so many things that is covered. Like, when we look at the history of our known history, right, based on things that have been discovered. A lot of people, there's legends that exist in our mythologies, right? And, through a Western lens, often it's like, well, there's no evidence of it, therefore it did not exist. But as we know, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I think data points are legitimate when it comes to stories, right? They may all be interpreted differently, but it doesn't mean that it's false just because there is no tangible thing, which is an irony because so much of our digital world, right, is intangible. And I think you bring up good points because this culture aspect, I've been noticing there's like almost a resurgence in the West of people now wanting to go back to their own roots as well in Western countries. Let me share my screen because I saw this on Twitter recently. Chrome tab window. There we go. All right. Do you see this?
I see it.
Right. There's a few things, right? One, Poland, really interesting case study. But if you look down here, they talk about how Poland was able to make a comeback by not necessarily resisting technology, but staying true to their own culture and heritage. And, you can see here, while the rest of Europe is debating statues, Poland is preserving cathedrals, restoring medieval squares, and opening palaces to the public. All these tangible aspects that you were, referring to. And so now here, tourism is booming, but not because Poland sold out, because it doubled down on what makes it Poland. And of course, I think from a news standpoint, stands in contrast to, say, the UK and other Western countries who have been criticized for taking in too many immigrants and that sort of stuff. But there was this interesting video I remember from the Dalai Lama where like a reporter had asked him, like, do you think it's a good thing that like England takes in immigrants? And he actually said no. And I think what he was trying to get at was this thing about religion and cultures and how they're tied to land, right? And that you end up eventually getting these great conflicts when the cultures don't resonate, right? And I think we're seeing this across the West. And they just weren't prepared for it. If you look at other countries who have been very clear on who they are from an identity standpoint, it's made things better for them at this point in time. I think places like Japan, no country or culture is perfect, but I think Japan,
Right.
when you go there, you know what's Japanese, right? It's very clear. They are not trying to cater to everybody when you come to Japan. They know who they are. They know their history, the good and bad, their traditions, their temples, their different belief systems, and it's very important. The problem I'm seeing also in the West is that many Western countries have lost who they are, their identity. So as much as I'm a mixed race person, right? Like we talked about in episode 1. But with that, with the beauty of diversity, also comes this feeling of not being grounded or not knowing who you are or your roots because of the trying to cater to everyone and everything, so feeling like you belong everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And so I can see the appeal for places wanting to reclaim their own cultural heritage. And I think that's why it's this cognitive heritage. This is more of my segue between the tech and the culture aspect, right? Because I think the cognitive aspect, the mind of an individual, right? When we look at culture, it starts usually with one founder, one person, and then those ideas spread, they get ritualized, they get institutionalized potentially, and then it becomes something that the collective agrees upon, right? That they're like, yeah, this is us. And all of these cultures have very strong sort of founder myths, right? That they will look to. We see elements of this in companies and startups, but yeah, sort of the reason why I share that, right, is because this is an example of how, like in the West, right, they're going through an identity crisis themselves, and there are certain countries that have stayed true to what they consider to be, as an example, what it means to be Polish. Right? I noticed there were a lot of comments that were just like race loaded, right? Race debates. Like, oh yeah, here you go. The whites. Now you know what it's like to be on the other side and to feel like a minority. And I understand the backlash, but it's not productive, right? I do believe every culture, regardless of your skin color, you have every right to be proud of your own culture, right? Because we all have light and dark within our histories. So yeah, I thought I'd share that because this was kind of like a really interesting.
That is really fascinating because
Yeah.
I mean, I just kind of saw when you were scrolling, and it's curious because it seems that maybe Poland has pegged themselves to a modern Polish identity.
Hmm.
It's not as if they picked the Polish identity of pre, let's say, antiquity, which I don't know what that would have been actually, or an identity from 600 years ago, because they did have instances of foreign powers trying to invade ancestral lands and take them over from the 1700s until the 1900s, right? So it seems like this Polish identity that they have selected as a Polish identity might be an offspring of that, right? And it goes back to your initial kind of probing in the beginning of purity. So
Yep.
so it's like, well, what is this new Polish culture? I'm not Polish, and I've never even been to Poland. So when I say I don't have a horse in this race or anything like that, I really don't. But it's just a curious thing because I'm with you on that. I actually think that there's nothing wrong with nation states saying, hey, actually, we're going to do our own thing and we're going to be who we want to be. And people are welcome to come, but here's our national identity, right? And I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think you can have a national identity and you can still have an open society, right? And
Yeah.
still have people who are different than what the national identity might be, right? In Poland, I'm just assuming the national identity probably is very white because these are white people, but it doesn't mean if you're not white, maybe you're not going to have a good time, a safe time, a productive time in any Polish city, right? So I think
Correct.
it's an interesting probing because then what do you pick? And, the concept of the ancient as modern again that I've been playing with in my own personal research does beg that question. And I think this is going to be for the next episode, but it's the concept of time because what's been really popular is this linear concept of time, which is not the indigenous concept of time. And within indigenous identity, we have our own different concepts of time. And so if you go back to an identity, what timeline are you honoring? What flow of time have you chosen, right? And I think I don't know, it's just like good for Poland, I guess. Like, why not? And at the
Yeah.
same time, what will be these new cultural artifacts? Like, who will Poles be in the future? Like, I think it's really curious to see because, you've kind of got the opposite in some other places. I'm thinking of some people in that area of the world, like Estonia has very open borders, or Croatia and the digital nomad visas, where they're really opening their borders. They're really kind of identity is like we're technologists,
Yeah.
like go to Estonia, have the best internet in the world kind of thing. And so I think I don't know, like the world is picking its artifacts, as in a lot of places are picking how they're going to cultivate their people and how their people are going to be a part of this new artifact. So I'm going to stay tuned. Like now I'm very curious. I'm going to have to do the clickety clacks and
Yeah.
see about
Yeah.
Poland. I think that's exciting.
I mean, I think those are good examples that you gave, like with Estonia, because when I went there, I really enjoyed it. And I think also is I love going to a city and learning about their culture, right? And I think one of my pet peeves with like metropolitan cities is that no matter where I've gone around the world, they all start to look the same, right?
Yes.
Regardless of which country I'm in. And so that's the thing about culture, which I find important and beautiful, because kind of without a strong cultural identity, everything starts to just standardize into this blocky city looking thing, right? That it gives some comfort to people who want to go to different countries and feel like, oh, yay, this feels great because it's familiar. But, a place like Estonia was, to me, it was like very clear who an Estonian was, right? Right. Of course, they're white European. But as you mentioned, they are still very open. And I think that's the thing. It's like, know who you are, what it means to be Estonian. And there should be some resistance in terms of becoming Estonian if you're not like natively from that place. Because that friction is part of the learning process. And I think with culture, it needs to be there because there is sort of like a resonance field, right? It's like you're trying to resonate with it. If you're, say, for example, if Estonia is like the note of B sharp and you're coming in and you're a D, right? Do you harmonize with that or not? And
Mm.
if not, how do you tune your frequency to that? That's how I see it. And this is why that cognitive heritage aspect is kind of like that mind frequency that is shown through these artifacts, as you mentioned, of culture. And I think those artifacts are literally, if we were to use some of the more scientific terms, it's like where the frequency has gotten to a point where it's solidified as a thing, right? And that you can then take that and be like, yeah, this is a representation of our culture. But I think what you were mentioning time before, there was a movie I watched with my wife recently called Lucy. Have you heard of it? with Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah, she's like
Long, like
artificial intelligence. It's yeah,
mhm.
it's like by this point, is it 15 years old? I don't even know how old it is.
2014, I think, right?
Oh,
So it was about a decade ago, and I didn't realize I never saw it. But
it's
watching
really
it
good.
now, really good, right? And it's very relevant to now. But there was a certain scene where she was talking about time, and she was talking about how the more that we access, right, more parts of our brain. This is the cognition part that I was thinking about. There, of course, gets we human beings get to a point where we would not even need our bodies anymore, right? But she also mentioned how when you speed up time, there comes a point where you're sped up so quickly you cease to exist. And it makes me think about the way that we operate is that we've been given time, we've been given the ability to slow down so that we can literally exist in relationship to one another. And culture seems to be the thing that allows us to mirror to each other all the different facets of us. And I think that's why I always get so fascinated, because it's like if we are all connected, all of these different facets of us are producing these cultural artifacts, right? That allows us to see the beauty of ourselves. But we're so stuck in like these conflicts of no, that other person is not me, or that other culture is not me, and not really taking the time to look at the beauty that all of them may provide. That's generally how I see it. And I shared the resonance thing, right, with musical notes. That's how I tend to see
Hmm.
culture. It's like I see culture as this sort of like resonance, like in music. And it's like you even hear it in language. People are like, I don't vibe with this thing, or I don't vibe with these people, right?
Hmm.
It's like the same sort of like musical language, which I know in our indigenous cultures we had song lines, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
No, I think that that's actually a really fascinating one, and we are going to talk about that in the next episode. I specifically am going to just put a little bookmark here. We're going to talk about time, and we're going to talk about frequency because I think that they are actually very closely related. But we are going to let these good people go. Thank you all so much for joining us for the second episode of the Ancient as Mod Pod. Catch us on the third one.
Bye.